Okay, so let's switch to the next of our mindsets that we've kind of mapped out. And the next one is very much around this concept of attention. What does an advisor pay attention to compared to what an advisor pays attention to? A CEO pays attention to. And I think, and you've actually written an awful lot about this in your career, and obviously given your background in psychotherapy, I think it's important for the audience. There's some pretty strong kind of scientific thinking and academic thinking around like how does the human brain like decide what to pay attention to. Can you just kind of talk a little bit about that to kind of get us kicked off?
Absolutely, Gordon. You know, the research that we're seeing in, you know, the discipline of behavioral economics has led to a tremendous amount of inquiry about perception, what the role of perceiving information is, how much the brain adds to or sorts out information so that we can cope with the bewildering amount of data that's coming at us all the time. As you notice any of my videos, I operate with a black background so that the amount of distraction around me is minimized. And the reason for that is it will facilitate the tendency of the brain of my listener to focus on the pieces of information that now are kind of outlined or emphasized by virtue of the fact that so much of the space in the screen doesn't have any information in it at all. It's coal black, right? Now, that's with intention, because what we know from this research is that the brain at any given moment is editing out of awareness most of the information that's coming through the sensory channels. At any given moment, for example, Gordon, your entire body has what are called proprioceptive nerve stimuli that are helping you manage your body. You're unconsciously, for example, maintaining the right balance in the chair by virtue of the pressure you're perceiving on your legs and your back in terms of that data feedback. Well, you can't be consciously aware of all that because it's there. I mean, your unconscious is aware of it, and there's a part of the brain that processes that. But even as you're listening to me talking about something, your brain is zooming in and zooming out on certain topics. When I talk about your thighs and your buttocks and your lower back, you know, attached to the chair, your brain kind of makes this vivid recollection. You start paying attention to that information, and you will in fact stop paying attention to the words that are coming out of my mouth. You kind of you enter and exit the flow of information because the brain can only process a very small amount of highly detailed sensory stimuli at one time. We in fact, if you look at the way the eye works, you're only actually taking in high quality data in about a 17 to 23%, 17 to 23 degree arc right in front of your eyes, where the intensity of the rods and cones are highly concentrated in the back of the retina. The rest of your field of vision is largely constructed by the brain just to make it coherent. You don't actually perceive much of the stuff that's outside of your immediate focus. Now, why does that matter? Well, for leadership, or let's say, you know, this dynamic difference between the advisor and the CEO. In both cases, their brain has to decide what information am I going to pay attention to, as in what information is important for my well-being and my survival. That's ultimately the goal of the brain. The goal of the brain is to take in and process only that information that is necessary for me to survive. In the case of the modern human, to succeed takes the place of survive. Most of us aren't experiencing life and death survival decisions on a moment by moment basis in our business life. If you are, I would suggest getting a new job, because that sounds incredibly stressful. But succeeding becomes that new kind of guiding principle. All right, so for an advisor to succeed, what do they have to pay attention to? Well, largely, in the role of the advisor, they have to pay attention to information that is highly detailed outside of them and in their immediate field of reference. So they're very detail oriented, very much in the moment, very much paying attention to how is the client deciding, is the client satisfied, what's happening in the markets, what's going on with this client's wealth management issues. In many cases, for example, when we talk to advisors about creating a standard of care, which is a kind of an explicit articulation of what are the wealth management issues that we advise upon. And I've known advisors that have a very, very tiny, very narrow standard of care where they only advise on a few things. I know advisors that have a standard of care that has dozens of separate wealth management strategies that they advise upon as a standard deliverable. Well, that wealth management standard of care represents attention that the advisor is paying. What's going on with this human? Are all these things happening? Am I putting together the actions that will lead to that client continuing to reward me with the fee, that client continuing to engage me, perhaps referring others to me? So very much the span of attention of the advisor is immediate, it's external, and as a result, once the advisor programs that assumption, in other words, when you do the job for a couple of years, it almost becomes as unconscious as the pressure of your legs in the chair. You kind of you're naturally paying attention to the client. How's the client doing? And what pieces am I picking up on that individual? Am I seeing enough clients? And interestingly, and this is a kind of a segue into the idea that I think the CEO mind shift is very different. And perhaps of all the shifts we'll discuss, Gordon, this may be the hardest, especially if the CEO retains a portion of their time in the role of advisor. And then that becomes an even greater challenge because you're constantly being pulled back into this very tightly defined, very narrow, very tunnel vision, immediate issue. So the advisor who's operating this way, for example, and a very interesting observation, many advisors, when they start out in business, they're hungry and they are looking for new clients, and it's literally, and many advisors, probably the majority of advisors I've talked to have said, that first couple of years, if they had a heartbeat, they were a client. It's all good. Okay. Well, I know advisors who never got over that, who never changed that mindset. And so they're constantly looking around and, and whatever's right in front of me, is that a possible client? Is that a possible client? They're not discriminating, and they're not attaching a different filter. And so they're just, taking it in. And they'll even defend that as important in their world. And who am I to tell you shouldn't do that? Interestingly, as soon as an advisor questions that kind of basic reactive assumption about the world, and for example, I will go to an advisor and I will say, well, let's talk about what do you want as the future of your business? And they'll say, well, I want to go up market and I want to have larger clients with larger assets, right? Fewer clients so I can do greater quality work. I said, okay, well, let's talk about how you're going to get there. So 5 years from now, you want to have half as many clients as twice as many assets. That seems like a great goal, right? Very few advisors would look at that and say, no, I don't want that. All right, well, now what you're going to have to do is create a different filter, because now if you're going to go up market, the first thing you're going to need to do is get a dashboard that says, okay, as I look at my business right now, not in granular, is that client satisfied? What are we doing for Martha? How soon can we get that check cut for Sid? All the details, which have to be paid attention to. As soon as you say, okay, what kind of client do I want to work with? Is my practice is the average asset per client getting bigger? Am I tracking that? Am I establishing account minimums below which I will not bring in a client? And it's interesting to me how often advisors will set that account minimum, but and again, what you're seeing there is an individual who's very much in a reactive attention type mode. The advisor who starts to go up market very intentionally is taking on a CEO mind shift. And that's you see these advisors who are very intentional in that regard. They're the kind of advisor you want to have as a CEO, because the attention of the CEO is very interesting here, and a very important distinction. It's not the opposite of the advisor. So it's not like the advisor is all reactive, immediate. The CEO is non-reactive, more internally aware of their vision. So instead of looking outward, they're looking inward, right? And not immediate, but more long-term. What do I imagine we should look like 3 or 4 or 5 years from now? And what are the steps we're going to need to take to get there? That, in most cases, advisors can't do that. They're so focused on the immediate. And we see some CEOs that have a great deal of difficulty with that, and as a result, they continue to react to immediate issues without this larger anchoring of a vision. Where are we headed? Why are we going there? What'll it mean when we get there? And what do we need to do to make that happen? So what the CEO mind shift is, in terms of attention, is attention that scales up and down, back and forth, out and back, up and down, big picture, medium, little picture, big picture, little picture, in the following way. I have a vision of where I want us to go. In order to get us there, I also have to have an awareness of where we're at. The way I get an awareness of where we're at is I'm looking at a dashboard that tells me key indicators of what's true right now. So I can zoom in and look at this area and say, okay, why is that indicator like that? Do we have have we standardized our client reviews? If we have, in our client review, as I teach the review, there's a specific place where you stimulate referrals from the client. There's a very particular way we do it. I never recommend people ask for referrals, but we have a very intentional, designed stimulus for referrals. So now I can look at my business and I can say I've got 1,000 clients and 10 advisors. We have a standard process of doing that. That should translate into, we'll assume, certain number of referrals based on our historical experience of this. Why are my numbers down? Now I can dig even further in and say, okay, because we have 5 advisors, we're not following the protocol. Now the CEO looks at that and says, if we're not growing at this pace, we can't get to where we're headed because we want to be adding headcount. We want to add 3 more offices. I now have multiple levels of attention on my business, from very granular down to John isn't fulfilling on the vision of our client review, all the way out to I know when we want to buy that 3rd office or set up that 3rd office. That, learning how to do that, doing it consistently, and balancing the attention of the immediate with the longer term is the learning process that is so challenging for CEOs. It's very hard to do. And as I said, if you're still an advisor half the time, that means your brain is pulled back into the immediate. Remember what Kahneman tells us, and all of the research that Kahneman does. In fact, it's all of behavioral economics. Thaler, everybody's research shows the same thing. That brain that does that good work of visioning, that creative work of where are we headed and assessing, are we getting there? What are the next steps? Because all that's generated internally. It's not something you pull from outside. It's something you push from inside, right? That uses significant amounts of energy. So the operation of the rational decision-making and visioning process uses a lot of energy. And so does, by the way, reacting to client needs and fulfilling on a standard of care to make sure the client is highly gratified and having positive experiences intentionally. Well, now this advisor, CEO, who's expending energy in both directions, exhausts that energy. And what will typically happen when they exhaust energy, their ability to vision and create and navigate the tiring process of keeping the big picture clear descends, and they become reactive, immediate, short term, and their decision making becomes very, what we would call impoverished. So they would have impoverished decision making because of the way they're expending their energy. In all of my consulting, there are times when CEOs have to transition kind of gradually, but I really want, if at all possible, for the sake of the organization, as much of the time, effort, energy, and mental work as possible being protected into that CEO role, and as little as possible in this other area, because it simply compromises the hard work of that leadership role.
So how do you differentiate then? If you're saying, okay, you want it to be more, you want your attention to be on the more forward-thinking project, strategies and priorities, but there's many things up front that might be a burning fire, right? Like, what about a client complaint? If how do you decide what do I dive into in the near ground and what should I actually stay away from?
And if we could answer that question, Gordon, if we could get that precisely answered exactly right, we could retire tomorrow, because the demand for that one is huge, and it is impossible to figure that out. But I thought you might ask me this, so I remembered a experience in my own life that kind of, I think, illustrates the way I would want a CEO to observe that. So I, as you know, and the audience may not know, in my primary role at the Advisor Institute at Alliance Bernstein, I am a keynote speaker. I do talks all over the country. It's not uncommon when in pre-pandemic times, I might be 4 days on the road, and I might do 15 or 20 presentations in different places. Sometimes I'll do 3 conferences in a day in different parts of the city, branch meetings, et cetera. Well, years ago, I was, this is probably 8 or 9 years ago, I was asked to go to California, very long trek to get to California, very early morning meeting. The host of the meeting didn't understand I had been sent there by the CEO of his firm to do a particular thing as a favor to the CEO. I was doing this person a favor, but the host of the meeting wasn't read in on it and screwed up the process. And I eventually had to go to him and say, look, here's why I'm here. Here's what I'm representing. I have to speak because my plane leaves in X. I'm doing somebody a favor. So it was a very awkward kind of start to the talk. And it was a big group of advisors. And I did a talk I was doing a lot of. And because I started kind of off balance, the group didn't have an experience of my good humor. So they had this experience of this kind of stern, hurried, annoyed person, which I can be, hopefully not often, right? But I kind of got into the talk and I started warming up, and I thought the audience was more or less with me, and I think most of them were. And there's one part in this little talk that I told a joke on myself, and it had to do with the fact that I wasn't sure if because I've been on the road so much, the locks might be changed on the door when I get home. Right? And there's more to the joke than that, but it fit the context. But I wanted to make sure in this moment, I just want to make sure it was a bit of a joke on me, but it involved my wife at the time. And so I do the talk, I finish, I pack up, I go away. It takes 3 days. I'm back in New York, and I happen to have a meeting with my boss. It's maybe a week later. And my boss says, oh, I got a call from so-and-so, the regional manager for such and such firm. Apparently you told a joke. A member of the audience didn't appreciate the joke, and they wanted me to make sure you knew that you were out of line in telling that joke. And now what had happened was somebody had taken umbrage with me. That happens, right? Had ramped it up to their branch manager. The branch manager had ramped it up to the regional manager. That had magnified, gone over to my boss. Now my boss is coming back to me, and he sternly reminded me that I needed to watch how I told jokes because they can be misinterpreted, and et cetera. Now, at that time, I was 15 years older than my boss. I'm doing 5 or 6 talks a day. I've done over 10,000 talks just in the last few years at AllianceBernstein, let alone what I did before that. I have the highest rating of speakers, and no one ever takes offense at my jokes because I tell very few and they're never off color. It was a completely ridiculous thing for him to do. Now, why am I telling that story? Because he had lost his way and was reacting to the fact that somebody called him and complained about this joke. And rather than stopping and looking and saying, do we have a joke problem here? And deciding, was it worth the attention and the tension that it created as a leader, right? What happened in that moment is he lost my confidence. Now, I looked at him and I said, I don't have confidence that you're sorting out information as a leader should, so that when you do speak to me, the first thing I'm going to think of is, do I even need to listen to what you're saying? Why? Because he didn't filter it. He didn't look at it and say, in this world of what I'm managing, and as I know what's going on with this person whose ratings are off the charts, this is not a problem. And so the first thing I would say to what you're talking about is, when things are on fire, the question is, what should the CEO be thinking about that? If a client is complaining, should the CEO race in? Well, maybe what the CEO should do is, if the advisor feels it would be helpful, the advisor can request the CEO make an outreach to this individual. But if the CEO is finding themselves doing this over and over again, then what I would suggest to you is, you don't have a client complaint problem, you have an advisor management problem, and you define your problem so that it makes sense for you to be addressing it in what way. You don't want to be called in 5 times a week to deal with angry clients. You want to stop whatever's causing the angry client, right? And you want to look and see, what is my problem? So the most important thing for a CEO to do, because they are always going to have limited span of attention, and that's always going to be the case. There's a limited amount of rational energy that the brain has to work on. The first step every CEO should take is, especially if something is activating them, there's anxiety coming up, is to ask themselves the question, what is the actual problem we have here? And that question should be set in the context of a famous quote by Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein said, if I had 1 hour to save the world, I would spend the first 50 minutes defining the problem. Because any problem, accurately and adequately defined, will tend to yield an obvious solution. But if you're not clear about what problem you have, and you jump in reaction to the fact of, oh, somebody told a joke, I need to nip that in the bud, you can create more of a problem than you're actually solving, because you didn't ask the question, do I actually have a problem here? Or was this just some annoyed person talking to some harried person, talking to some authoritative control freak, and do I need to just stop that and not metabolize it and hand it off to my own person? A great leader metabolizes a lot of the reactivity of their organization and pays attention to and speaks to and works on and worries about and feels the burden of those positive forward moving items rather than the reactive stuff in the world. Now, look, that is to say, however, that as I said, if you have 5 complaints a week that advisors are saying, hey, could you call this client, could you call this client? After 2 or 3 weeks, I'd say, okay, what's my problem? My problem is not complaining clients. My problem is somehow my advisors are not creating the experiences that keep clients very happy. Let's start looking at what the actual problem is here. And that's tricky. It's not easy necessarily to get clear about it, but it allows the CEO to raise up above reacting. If there's a lot of distrust and disagreement among staff members, a lot of times it's like, oh, we have personality conflicts. Almost never is it a personality conflict. It's usually something else. So if they can just pause for a minute and say, okay, what is the problem that I have here? What am I actually looking at? and again, keep out of it enough that you can look down and say, okay, where is the issue here? And for example, this is something that's very true among some of your teams. I know this. You have an advisor and a long-standing sales assistant, almost like that symbiotic kind of powerful, we finish each other's sentences, like the partner at work as opposed to the partner at home, right? All right. So the advisor joins a larger group, and now or let's say they take in a couple of practices and grow kind of inorganically, they grow by acquisition, and now they have a larger platform of clients, and they need to hire 2 more support staff. And so now you have longstanding, very senior support staff, 2 new support people, one of which has maybe some superior talents, really great to have acquired this person. All of a sudden, there's all kinds of conflict between the 3 of these support staff, right? Do you have a personality problem? No, you have a sense of this partnership of 20 years has now been diluted in 3, and this person is feeling like they've lost something. That's your problem. Now, there's various ways of dealing with that, but if you assume that somehow it's a personality conflict, and you go and you get your DISC or your Myers-Briggs or so, let's come in and we'll work out our communication. It's not a communication problem. It's a hurt feelings problem, right? So again, it's stuff like that if the CEO can get away from the reactive moment and maintain their attention on the bigger pictures and the question, what's the actual problem here? And do I in fact have a problem, or is this somebody else's problem that needs to be worked on? Now you have a mind that's leading from the right point of view.
And you'd mentioned before Daniel Kinahan and his book and his writings, and he's done an awful lot about kind of narrow framing. Is that what you're kind of talking about here?
Well, I think it's exactly the challenge, that narrow framing, as we've discussed, but again, I'll just review briefly, Kahneman's great contribution of many is this idea that when the brain is either threatened by a danger, as I tell the story of hiking in the Grand Tetons and coming into a clearing, big side of the mountain, an open meadow, and 100 yards in front of me is a grizzly bear. In that moment, my neurological, hardwired, instinctive reaction was 110% focus on the bear and nothing else. That's narrow.
So focus on the complaint. Focus on the client complaint.
Right. So when my boss says, "Oh, there was a joke," and he's focused on that, he's narrow framed on that, and by narrow framing on that, he's defining the problem as Ken has a problem telling jokes. If he broad frames it, if he's able to pause for a minute, say, okay, this was threatening, somebody yelled at me on the phone, I am now going to pass this on to Ken, which is a terrible practice. My mantra for CEOs is the CEO is the person supposed to be a shock absorber to the organization, not a shock transmitter to the organization. We have a financial crisis. Everybody needs to feel bad. No. We have a financial crisis. I need to be deeply involved in this. Others that are appropriately pulled into this, but my job is to be a non-anxious presence. My job is to be a steady hand on the tiller. My job is to reduce everybody else's stress so they can perform, right? So narrow framing is that tendency to zoom in. Broad framing is hard because it requires the brain to take in more information and see the bigger picture. And for example, in aviation, what the American Federal Aviation Association figured out, or administration figured out, was that a lot of aircraft accidents were happening because, this is going back into the 60s and the 70s, before they created a new protocol, both pilots would get so focused on solving the problem in the cockpit, maybe it was a landing gear issue or a fuel issue or an engine failure issue, whatever, that nobody was flying the airplane, and then bad things would happen. This is a natural tendency of humans, that if there's a problem, especially a problem if you're up in an airplane, if you're the pilot, bad things happen to you first, right? Because you're at the pointy end of the airplane, right? So it tends to galvanize your attention. So what the FAA did was they said, well, we can't change that. We can't teach humans not to narrow frame because it's built in. You can't avoid it. What they did was they split the task. So they would say, in any emergency situation, the captain's first job is to decide who flies and who solves. And whoever's flying doesn't solve, whoever's solving doesn't fly, and they don't pay attention to the other person's problem. I start flying the airplane with great focus of attention, and you start solving. Now that's a great metaphor for a CEO. Because the CEO may want to wade in and solve the problem, but somebody's got to fly the airplane. And flying the airplane means, and as any great commercial pilot will tell you, your brain needs to stay ahead of the airplane. You fly the plane from ahead of yourself. If ever you're back in the cockpit in terms of your attention, you're failing in your job as a pilot. You fly from in front of the airplane. You land an airplane by landing by your own intention, heading into that field before the airplane does. And that is a great example for the CEO. Now, for the CEO, there is the sense of, as the pilot, okay, what's my current status? Where am I headed? What's my current status? Where am I headed? It's a splitting of attention, but I'm not trying to fix the fuel problem in the left engine. That's somebody else's issue. And CEOs need to learn how to do that. Because look, management in the simplest terms, if you look at Peter Drucker, some of the other great names in management consulting, said management is nothing more than getting things done through people. And a great way to think about this, advisors' job is to get stuff done, right? And they may delegate a task to their sales assistant that is a task that doesn't require professional strategy or whatever it may be. But the advisor's job is to get stuff done. The CEO's job is to have a vision, to fly us where we're going, to understand how we're going to get there, to make the strategic decisions along the way, and to put people in place to get all the stuff done that keeps the organization profitable and growing. He or she's job is to get stuff done through others. The more they're weighing in, the more they're a necessary participant in problem solving, the more weak their organization is going to be. A great CEO very rarely is confronted with issues within the organization. It happens because no organization is immune from challenges, but the great CEO spends a lot more time in those larger issues and forming the organization, moving the organization, training and coaching and recruiting and visioning and developing, so that the organization evolves and moves forward. And if you are spending your time on that, you understand what it means to be a CEO. If you're spending your time on a lot of other nuts and bolts stuff, there's some growth and development that needs to happen.
That's excellent. We've covered an awful lot today, Ken. Thank you so much for your time as always. And unfortunately, time has been our enemy. So we'll have to draw it there. But thank you so much for your time, Ken. For those of you that are listening, this, like I said, this is part of an ongoing series. As part of the Dynasty Advisor CEO program, you can definitely access these recordings in the Dynasty knowledge base, as well as on our website and in our social media. And if there's any questions that might have been raised throughout these discussions, please feel free to reach out to Dynasty. More than happy to talk more about this, more than happy to put you in contact with Ken and the AllianceBernstein team. And we're very much in the process of discussing how to kind of turn some of these into in-person events out there in the field over the next few months. So with that, Ken, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Talk soon, Gordon.